Everything below looked organized, almost obedient, as if the entire city had quietly agreed to move according to someone else's design. Most people believed that someone was Damian Sterling. I had only been working in his penthouse for 3 weeks, but even before that I knew who he was. In New York, people like Damian Sterling didn't need introductions. His name appeared in financial magazines, business podcasts, and evening news segments that talked about billion-dollar investments as casually as weather reports. Founder of Sterling Dynamics, tech visionary, market disruptor. The words followed him everywhere. But standing inside his home every day, watching the rhythm of his life unfold, I noticed something the headlines never mentioned. Damian Sterling lived inside a world so carefully constructed that almost nothing surprised him anymore. Everything was controlled. The penthouse itself felt less like a home and more like a statement of power. Polished marble floors reflected the glow of floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the entire Manhattan skyline. Sculptures from European galleries stood quietly in hallways that were larger than most apartments in the city. Even the air carried a faint scent of expensive wood and something subtle I could never quite identify. Nothing inside that space existed by accident, including the people. House staff moved like quiet shadows, each person responsible for maintaining some part of the illusion. The chef controlled the kitchen. The assistant controlled Damian's schedule. Security controlled the entrances. And people like me made sure the place never looked lived in. Invisible work. Invisible people. That part never bothered me as much as people might assume. Invisibility had advantages. It meant no one asked questions. It meant no one noticed when I slipped a notebook into my apron pocket. It meant no one paid attention when I stayed an extra 30 minutes after my shift to sit in the small service lounge and read. Most of the staff thought I was strange for that. Maybe they were right. But the truth was simple. Cleaning luxury apartments had never been my plan. 2 years earlier, I had been sitting in lecture halls at Columbia University studying economics, arguing about financial policy with professors who believed I might someday work in corporate strategy or international investment. Then my mother got sick. Medical bills arrived faster than scholarships could cover. Within months, the future I had been building collapsed into something smaller, quieter, and much more practical. So I left school. Work replaced lectures. Long shifts replaced research papers. But the ambition that had pushed me into that university in the first place never really disappeared. It just became quieter. Most nights after finishing my work at the penthouse, I sat in the staff lounge with textbooks about financial markets and corporate strategy. Sometimes the security guard passed the doorway and gave me a confused look. A maid studying investment theory probably wasn't something he saw often. But I never explained. Explaining meant attention. And attention inside Damian Sterling's world could be dangerous. The first time I saw Damian in person, he barely noticed me. He entered the penthouse early in the morning surrounded by assistants speaking rapidly about contracts and market forecasts. His voice was calm but sharp, the voice of someone used to being obeyed without hesitation. He walked past me while I was adjusting a sculpture near the window. For a second, I thought he might say something. But his eyes passed over me the way people glance at furniture. Not cruelly. Just automatically. That moment told me everything I needed to know about how the world inside this apartment worked. Still, there were moments when I caught him watching me. They were brief. Almost accidental. Sometimes when I passed through the hallway carrying a tray or arranging the living room before guests arrived, I felt his gaze pause for half a second longer than expected. It wasn't curiosity exactly, more like confusion. As if something about my presence didn't fit neatly into the mental categories he usually placed people in. But those moments always disappeared quickly, because Damian Sterling had someone far more interesting in his life. Victoria Langford. Even before I met her, I knew her name. The internet made that impossible to avoid. Social media followed her everywhere. Fashion magazines described her as one of Manhattan's most influential socialites. Her family owned investment firms older than most tech companies. And 3 months earlier, she had become Damian Sterling's fiancée. When Victoria first walked into the penthouse, the entire energy of the apartment changed. Confidence filled the room before she even spoke. She carried herself like someone who had never needed permission to belong anywhere. Her heels echoed across the marble floors, sharp and deliberate, announcing her presence to everyone within hearing distance. Unlike Damian, she noticed the staff immediately, but not in a way that made anyone comfortable. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, measuring people. Judging, I felt her gaze land on me for a moment that lasted just slightly too long. Then she smiled, not warmly, just knowingly. That was the first moment I understood something about Victoria Langford. She believed the world existed in layers, and she always intended to remain at the top. Over the next few days, she appeared more frequently in the penthouse, discussing wedding plans, charity galas, and social events that seemed to involve half of Manhattan's wealthiest families. Most of those conversations happened in the living room while I worked quietly nearby, invisible again. Or so I thought, because one evening, while I was arranging glasses for an upcoming gathering, Victoria paused mid-conversation and glanced toward me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she had just noticed something unusual, something that didn't belong. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the light, effortless tone of someone about to turn an ordinary evening into something much more uncomfortable. She had just decided to host a private dinner in the penthouse, a dinner that would bring some of the most powerful people in New York into the same room. At the time, it sounded like just another event. But something about the way Victoria looked at me in that moment made a quiet tension settle in my chest. The kind of feeling that comes right before a storm, because that dinner wasn't going to be ordinary. It was going to expose something about everyone in that room, including me. What none of them knew yet was that by the end of that dinner, Victoria Langford would try to humiliate the one person she believed didn't belong in her world, and Damian Sterling's reaction would shock every guest sitting at that table. The evening Victoria Langford planned arrived faster than I expected. From early morning, the penthouse no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage preparing for a performance where every detail had to appear effortless. Staff members moved through the rooms with quiet urgency. Silverware was polished twice. Wine glasses were aligned so precisely they almost looked measured with a ruler. Even the lighting was adjusted carefully to create the kind of golden glow that made expensive rooms appear even more impressive. Victoria supervised everything personally. She moved through the apartment like someone inspecting a kingdom she had just inherited. Her voice carried the soft authority of a woman who had spent her entire life being obeyed. "Make sure the seating follows the order I sent earlier," she said to Damian's assistant while glancing over the dining arrangement. Our Mr. Caldwell should sit closer to Damian. Investors like to feel important. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough that no one questioned her instructions. I stayed mostly in the background, helping organize the service trays and making sure the dining area remained flawless. Nights like this demanded precision. In places where wealth gathered, even small mistakes became memorable. But as the afternoon turned into evening, I noticed something unsettling. Victoria kept watching me, not openly. Just quick glances that lasted a second too long. At first I assumed she was simply observing the way some hosts did during events. But there was something else behind her gaze, something that felt less like curiosity and more like irritation. It didn't make sense. I had barely spoken to her since she began spending more time at the penthouse. Still, the tension lingered. By 8 o'clock, the first guests arrived. The elevator doors opened one after another, releasing waves of expensive perfume, tailored suits, and quiet confidence. Investors, corporate executives, and social elites stepped into the living room like people entering a familiar arena. Conversations about markets and acquisitions filled the air almost immediately. The skyline beyond the glass walls shimmered behind them, turning the entire room into a kind of glittering theater for wealth. Damian Sterling stood near the window greeting guests with his usual calm professionalism. Unlike Victoria, his authority was quieter. He didn't need to dominate a room with energy. His reputation did that for him. For most of the evening, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Wine was served. Laughter echoed across the room. Deals were hinted at in casual conversations disguised as small talk. I moved between tables carefully, carrying trays and replacing glasses, keeping my attention fixed on my work. Invisible again. At least that was the plan. Dinner service began shortly after 9. Guests settled around the long marble dining table while the city lights flickered through the windows behind them. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost celebratory, until Victoria decided to change it. I noticed the shift the moment her eyes landed on me. I had just stepped forward to refill a wine glass near her seat when she spoke. "Oh," she said lightly, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach the entire table. "You're the new one, aren't you?" The room quieted slightly. I nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying me the way someone might study a painting they weren't sure they liked. "Interesting," she said. A few guests glanced between us, sensing the strange tension forming. She tilted her head slightly. "So tell me," she continued, "how long have you been working here?" 3 weeks, I replied calmly. Victoria smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. 3 weeks, she repeated slowly. "And already walking around this place like you've been here for years." A couple of guests shifted in their chairs. The comment sounded casual, but the edge behind it was unmistakable. I didn't respond. Experience had already taught me that silence often protected dignity better than explanations. Victoria noticed. Her eyes brightened slightly, as if my quietness amused her. "You know," she continued, lifting her glass thoughtfully, "Damian's home hosts some of the most influential people in the country." Her gaze moved deliberately across the table. People who build companies, who shape industries. Then her attention returned to me. "And yet somehow we still end up being served by people who probably have no idea what any of that even means." The words floated across the room like smoke, soft, but suffocating. No one laughed, no one defended me either. Several guests avoided eye contact. One woman near the end of the table suddenly became fascinated with her napkin. That silence was louder than Victoria's words. For a moment, the entire room felt uncomfortably still. I felt every pair of eyes watching me, waiting to see if I would react. But I had learned something important during the past 2 years. Dignity sometimes meant refusing to perform pain for people who expected it. So I simply nodded and continued pouring the wine. Victoria watched the movement carefully. Something about my calmness seemed to irritate her more than any argument would have. She laughed softly. "Well," she added, swirling the wine in her glass, "I suppose everyone has their place." The remark carried a weight that no one in that room could misunderstand, a quiet reminder of hierarchy, of who belonged and who didn't. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. But Victoria wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly and looked toward Damian. Then she said the one sentence that changed the entire atmosphere of the evening. "Tell me something, Damian," she said with casual curiosity. Did the agency forget to mention where she came from, or did you simply not care? The question forced the entire table to turn toward him. For the first time that night, Damian Sterling slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly at me. Really looked. Not the quick passing glance he usually gave the staff, but a careful, deliberate look. The room waited, because everyone could feel it. Something unexpected was about to happen. What no one at that table expected was that Damian's next reaction wouldn't defend Victoria at all, and the tension that followed would expose a side of him even his fiancée had never seen before. For a moment, no one at the table moved. Victoria's question still hung in the air, sharp and polished, the kind of cruelty dressed so elegantly it almost passed for conversation. Almost. I stood beside the table with the wine bottle still in my hand, feeling the weight of every eye in the room shift away from me and toward Damian Sterling. Until that moment, that he had remained mostly detached from the tension Victoria created, as if the entire scene belonged to some smaller world beneath his attention. But now he was looking directly at me. Not through me, at me. It was a strange thing, being truly seen by someone who had spent weeks treating my presence like part of the furniture. His expression didn't carry pity. It wasn't outrage either. It was something harder to define, something quieter and more unsettling. He looked confused, as if Victoria's words had forced him to notice a detail in the room that should have been obvious long ago. Victoria waited for him to respond, her posture relaxed, her confidence untouched. She expected alignment. She expected the kind of easy public agreement powerful couples used to display unity in front of an audience. Instead, Damian set down his glass. The small sound it made against the table seemed louder than it should have. Then he spoke. "What exactly are you asking, Victoria?" His tone was calm, but not warm, not protective. The question seemed to catch her off guard for half a second, though she covered it quickly with a smile. "I'm asking," she said lightly, "that whether anyone bothered to look into her background before placing her in the middle of evenings like this." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Her choice of words was deliberate. Not in this home. Not on this staff. In the middle of evenings like this. As if the room itself were sacred, and I had somehow contaminated it just by standing near the table. I kept my face still, but something cold moved through my chest. It wasn't surprise. Women like Victoria rarely needed to say things directly. They relied on implication, on tone, on the quiet violence of making someone feel out of place without having to explain why. Damian's eyes flickered toward me again. And that was when I realized something had changed. It wasn't only that he was paying attention. It was the way he was studying my silence. The way he seemed more affected by my refusal to shrink than by Victoria's performance itself. He noticed that I wasn't trembling. He noticed that I hadn't defended myself. He noticed that I was still standing there with my shoulders straight, as if I had decided that whatever happened in that room, I would not help them turn me into a spectacle. Something in his jaw tightened. Victoria saw it too. She let out a soft laugh, though now it sounded thinner than before. "Damian, don't look so serious. I'm only saying appearances matter." He didn't smile. "And what appearance are you worried about?" he asked. The question landed heavily. A man at the far end of the table lowered his eyes. One of the women seated near Victoria reached for her glass, suddenly very interested in the wine. Everyone could feel the shift now. This was no longer casual embarrassment. The room had stepped into more dangerous territory. Victoria's smile sharpened. "You know exactly what I mean." "No," Damian said, his voice still even. "I'd like you to say it clearly." The silence that followed felt electric. That was the twist no one expected. Not just that he refused to rescue her, but that he was forcing her to hear herself out loud. People like Victoria preferred cruelty when it could hide behind elegance. Damian was stripping that elegance away. For the first time all evening, I saw something flicker across her face. Not shame, annoyance. Because now she was the one being exposed. She leaned back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "I mean, she doesn't belong in the center of this kind of night. It's distracting. Distracting." The word should not have felt personal, but it did. Because it was not about my work. It was about my presence. About being seen at all. Damian looked at me one more time before answering, and that glance unsettled me more than Victoria's words had. "She seems to be doing her job perfectly," he said. Victoria blinked. "That isn't the point." "Then maybe that's the problem," he replied. The room went still again. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the bottle. Victoria stared at him, and now her expression had lost all softness. "You're taking this far too seriously. And you're making a point that shouldn't need making," he said. No one had expected this version of Damian Sterling. The businessman the public knew was controlled, calculated, rarely emotional. But there was something else beneath that control now. Not anger exactly. Something more dangerous. Possessiveness. The realization came to me so suddenly it made my pulse shift. He wasn't only offended. He was jealous. Not in the obvious, romantic way that would have made the room gasp. It was subtler and more disturbing than that. Victoria had turned me into an object in front of the room, and instead of dismissing it, Damian reacted as if her attention on me itself had crossed some invisible line, as if she had touched something he had not yet admitted he was watching. That truth changed the air around the table. Victoria felt it before anyone said a word. I could see it in the way her eyes moved between us now, quicker, sharper, searching for meaning in something she had never considered before. She laughed once more, but there was no ease left in it. "Interesting," she said quietly. "I didn't realize the staff had become so important." Damian's expression hardened. "This conversation is over." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority settled over the table immediately. The investors went silent. The socialites looked away. Even Victoria stopped speaking, though not because she wanted to. She stopped because she understood that if she pushed further tonight, she might lose the room entirely. I stepped back from the table, careful, controlled, determined not to let my breathing show. But I could still feel Damian's attention on me. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the humiliation, not even Victoria's hostility, it was the fact that Damian Sterling, who had barely noticed I existed weeks earlier, that was now watching me as if he had just realized I had been standing in front of him the entire time. And Victoria noticed it too. She didn't say another word for the rest of dinner, but she didn't need to. The way she looked at me had changed. The earlier contempt was still there, but now something darker had been added to it. Suspicion. By the time I carried the final tray back toward the kitchen, I understood with painful clarity that the worst part of the night was not over. It had only changed shape. As the dinner finally began to recover from the tension, Victoria kept her smile in place for the guests, but behind her eyes, a new fear had already taken root, and before the night was over, she would start looking for a reason to destroy me. The dinner ended with polished smiles, soft laughter, and the kind of false elegance wealthy people use to cover uncomfortable truths. From the outside, nothing had happened. Guests finished their wine. Investors resumed their conversations. Chairs slid back across marble floors with quiet restraint. Victoria even laughed twice before the last couple left, as if the tension from earlier had been nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. But I had spent enough time around powerful people to understand something important. The most dangerous damage was rarely loud. It settled into a room silently and waited. That night, after the final guests were gone, the penthouse felt strangely cold. The city lights still shimmered beyond the glass, and the skyline remained as beautiful as ever, but inside those walls something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I was clearing the last of dessert plates when I felt it again. Victoria watching me. I didn't look up immediately. I kept my movement steady, stacking silverware, lifting glasses, restoring order to a table that had quietly become a battlefield. But the sensation stayed there, heavy and deliberate. When I finally raised my eyes, she was standing near the far end of the dining room. Still. Elegant. Expressionless. The guests were gone, which meant she no longer needed to perform. That made her far more honest to look at. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she took a slow step forward. "You handled yourself very confidently tonight," she said. Her tone was smooth, but there was nothing kind inside it. I lowered my gaze again and placed another plate onto the tray. "I was only doing my job." Victoria gave a faint smile. "That's the interesting part." I said nothing. She moved closer, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Most people in your position would have looked embarrassed, uncomfortable, grateful when someone stopped the situation. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You looked almost untouched." The words lingered in the air between us. I could feel what she was really asking. Why didn't you break? Why didn't you make it easier for me to feel superior? But I had no intention of answering that question for her. So I kept my voice calm. There was nothing to say. Victoria studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. I saw it clearly then. This was no longer simple contempt. Contempt was easy. It looked down. This was fear beginning to search for evidence. She wanted to understand why Damian had looked at me the way he had. And worse, she wanted to understand why I hadn't seemed surprised by it. Before she could say anything else, Damian entered the dining room. The silence shifted instantly, and he had removed his jacket, and the loosened collar of his shirt gave him a slightly less polished appearance than usual, but the control in his expression was still there. His eyes moved first to Victoria, then to me, then to the tray in my hands. For one strange second, no one spoke. Then Victoria smiled too quickly. "There you are," she said. "I was just telling Arya how composed she seemed tonight." Damian's gaze rested on me for a moment too long. She was, that was all. 2 syllables. But they landed harder than Victoria expected. I saw it in the way her face stilled. She let out a quiet laugh. "You make it sound like she did something impressive." Damian walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of water before answering. "Composure is impressive when the room is trying to take it from someone." The words struck so precisely that even I stopped moving. Victoria turned to face him fully. "You're still thinking about that?" "I'm thinking about unnecessary cruelty," he said. His tone remained measured, but there was something underneath it now that made the air feel tight. Victoria folded her arms. "That's dramatic." "No," he replied. "What happened tonight was deliberate." The room fell silent again. I stood motionless beside the table, aware that I should have left, aware that staying made me a witness to something intimate and dangerous, but neither of them dismissed me. That alone told me how unsettled they both were. Victoria looked at him carefully, the way someone studies a crack in expensive glass, wondering whether it can still be hidden. "Since when do you care this much about staff?" she asked. That question was not really for him. It was for me too. And the worst part was that none of us fully knew the answer. Damian turned toward her slowly. "Since I noticed one of them was being humiliated for no reason." Victoria's eyes flashed. "Or since you noticed her at all." The words hit the room like a dropped blade. That was the twist. Not because she said it, but because Damian didn't deny it immediately. He looked at her, then at me, and in that pause something passed through the room that felt too raw to name. It was not romance. It was not affection. It was recognition, unfinished and dangerous. I broke the moment by lifting the tray. "I'll take these to the kitchen," I said quietly. Neither of them stopped me, but I could feel Victoria's stare follow me all the way down the hallway. After that night, the penthouse changed for me in 100 subtle ways. The Victoria began appearing in rooms where I worked, often without reason. She would enter the library while I dusted the shelves, stand near the kitchen doorway while I arranged flowers, or pause in the hall just to watch me pass. She never accused me of anything directly. That would have been too simple. Instead, she observed, measured, tested. She began asking small questions with hidden edges. Where had I worked before this? How long had I lived in New York? Did I always read so much during breaks? Or was that a recent habit? She asked them with smiles. That was what made them crueler, because every question sounded harmless unless one understood the intention beneath it. And Damian changed too. Not dramatically. Men like him never changed dramatically. But he started noticing things he had once ignored. He noticed when I reorganized the study shelves more efficiently than before. He noticed the financial section of the newspaper missing from the kitchen after I had used it. He noticed that when his assistant misplaced a folder of quarterly reports, I found it in the conference room before anyone else did once. While I was clearing cups from his office, he glanced at the open page of a business journal I had left briefly on the side table. "You read market analysis?" he asked. I hesitated. Sometimes, he repeated, as if the answer interested him more than it should have. I expected him to move on. Instead, he picked up the journal, scanned the page, and looked back at me. "This article is wrong about the merger risk," he said. Without thinking, I answered. "Only if they're measuring short-term exposure instead of long-term debt pressure." The silence that followed felt immediate and dangerous. I realized too late what I had revealed. Damian stared at me, not as a maid, not as background, as a question. And from the doorway, unseen until that moment, Victoria had heard enough to stop breathing for one sharp second. That night, Victoria stopped seeing me as a quiet housekeeper and started seeing me as something far more threatening, because she had just discovered there was a past behind my silence, and she was about to find out exactly what it was. The second Victoria heard me correct Damian about merger risk, the air in the room changed. It was subtle, but sharp enough for me to feel it immediately. Damian was still holding the journal in his hand, his eyes fixed on me with a level of attention that made me regret speaking at all. Victoria stood in the doorway behind him, silent in a way that felt far more dangerous than any insult she had thrown before. The quiet stretched long enough for all three of us to understand that something private had just been exposed. I lowered my eyes first. "I should get back to work," I said, but Damian didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the page again, then back at me. "You understood the article." It wasn't a question. The problem was that denying it now would sound ridiculous. So I gave the smallest nod possible. "A little." Victoria let out a soft laugh from the doorway, but there was no amusement in it. "A little," she repeated. "That must be one very educated little." I said nothing. Damian still hadn't taken his eyes off me. "Where did you study?" That question landed more heavily than it should have. Not because the answer was secret, but because it belonged to the life I had spent 2 years trying to carry without showing. The version of me that lived in classrooms and libraries felt very far from the woman standing in a billionaire's penthouse holding an empty coffee tray. I could have avoided it. I could have said nowhere important. I could have smiled politely and left. But something in Damian's expression stopped me. Not kindness, not even concern. It was recognition, unfinished and intense, as if he had already begun assembling pieces of me in his mind and needed the missing one to make sense of the rest. "Columbia," I said quietly. Victoria's smile disappeared. Damian's face stayed still, but I saw the shift in his eyes immediately. Surprise, then calculation, then something deeper that unsettled me more than either. "Respect? You studied at Columbia," he repeated. "Economics?" I said. The word hung there like it did not belong to me anymore. Victoria stepped farther into the room. "And yet here you are." Her voice was smooth again, but now the cruelty inside it had changed. Before, she had spoken to me like someone beneath her. Now she spoke to me like someone she needed to reduce quickly before anyone else realized she had underestimated me. I kept my tone neutral. "Life changed." Victoria folded her arms. "That happens to everyone. Most people don't end up cleaning penthouses because of it." I felt that one where she intended it to land. Not on my job. On my failure. On the fact that no amount of intelligence mattered if the world decided to break your path in the right place. Before I could answer, Damian spoke. "That's enough." He said it without raising his voice, but the room obeyed the words instantly. Victoria turned toward him with disbelief she tried to hide. "I'm only asking questions." "No," he said. "You're doing what you always do when something makes you uncomfortable." The silence after that was brutal. I should have left then. I knew it. But leaving would have felt like running, and I had already given Victoria too many chances to mistake my quietness for weakness, so I stood still while the tension moved between them. Damian looked back at me. "Why did you leave?" The question was gentler than I expected, and that made it harder. I swallowed once. "My mother got sick. The bills got worse. School became impossible. There it was plain. Unprotected. More honest than I had meant to be." For a brief moment, no one spoke. Even Victoria seemed caught off guard by how unadorned the truth sounded in the room. There was no dramatic fall, no scandal, no reckless mistake. Just money, illness, and the ordinary cruelty of a system that made survival more urgent than potential. Damian set the journal down slowly. "And you kept studying anyway," he said. Again, not a question. I gave the faintest shrug. Stopping completely felt worse. That was when I saw it happen. He looked at me differently. Not with pity. That would have been easier to dismiss. Pity creates distance. This did the opposite. His attention sharpened, deepened, as if every small thing he had ignored about me suddenly reassembled into a new picture he could no longer look away from. Victoria saw it too. That was the real danger. Not that she learned I had studied economics. Not even that she realized I was smarter than she had assumed. It was the expression on Damian's face when he understood it. Curiosity, respect, and something far more personal than either of those had any right to be. Victoria moved first, recovering herself with impressive speed. "Well," she said, lifting one shoulder, "that explains the books." I looked at her. She smiled, but it was the smile of someone cutting silk with a hidden blade. "Did you think no one noticed?" Late nights. Notes in the staff lounge. Financial journals left where they shouldn't be. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been playing invisible very carefully." I felt a chill move through me. So she had been watching longer than I realized. Damian's gaze shifted toward her. "You went through her things." Victoria's expression hardened for a fraction of a second. "Don't be ridiculous. I pay attention." Unlike some people, there it was again. The accusation beneath the sentence. Not "you noticed her." You noticed her too much. Damian ignored the bait, but that did not calm the room. It made it worse. Because every second he refused to dismiss me, Victoria had to sit inside the humiliation of being wrong about me. And powerful people rarely forgive the ones who expose that. I finally lifted the tray again. "I should go." This time Damian nodded, but his eyes stayed on me a moment longer. "Area." I paused. He seemed to consider his next words carefully, as if speaking too freely might reveal more than he wanted. "You should have had better options." The sentence struck me harder than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged loss without reducing me to it. That Victoria heard it too, and I knew instantly she would never forget it. I left the room with my pulse unsteady, carrying empty cups down the hallway as if they weighed more than glass ever should. Behind me, their voices didn't rise, but the silence between them grew louder than argument. That night, in the staff lounge, I tried to read, but the words blurred together. My mind kept returning to the look Damian had given me. It was not simple interest anymore. It was the beginning of a question he intended to answer. And questions from men like Damian Sterling rarely ended cleanly. The next morning, everything in the penthouse looked the same, but Victoria greeted me with a politeness so perfect it felt like a threat. And when Damian passed through the kitchen on his way to a call, that he paused just long enough to glance at the economics book near my folded apron before walking on. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because now Victoria understood something far worse than my past. The real threat was no longer that Area Bennett had once belonged to a world of intelligence and ambition. It was that Damian Sterling had started looking at her like she still did, and Victoria was about to do everything she could to stop that. After that night, Victoria stopped pretending her interest in me was harmless. Before, her cruelty had worn perfume and a smile. Now it arrived more openly, though never openly enough for anyone to accuse her of what she was doing. That was what made her dangerous. She understood how to wound a person in ways that left no visible mark and no clean evidence, only a trail of humiliation carefully disguised as standards, preferences, and correction. The first change was small. She began rearranging my duties without warning. Rooms I had already cleaned suddenly needed to be done again because she claimed the light revealed streaks no one else could see. Fresh flowers I arranged in the sitting room were removed and replaced. Then I was told my choices felt too heavy for the mood of the apartment. Table settings were reset 3 times because she said elegance depended on instinct, and instinct, in her opinion, could not be taught to everyone. She never raised her voice. That would have made it easier. Instead, she used softness like a weapon. "I know you're trying," she said one afternoon while lifting a folded linen napkin between 2 fingers. But refinement is usually something people grow up around. The other housekeeper standing beside me lowered her eyes at once. No one said anything, and Victoria smiled and placed the napkin back on the table. "Do it again." So I did. Not because she was right, but because survival inside that penthouse had begun to depend on understanding the difference between resistance and timing. The rest of the staff noticed quickly people became quieter around me. The chef stopped making small conversation when Victoria was nearby. Damian's assistant, who usually moved through the apartment with sharp efficiency, started pausing before giving me instructions, as if choosing words more carefully now that everyone understood I had become the unstable point in the household's balance. No one asked what had happened. They already knew. In places built on hierarchy, tension traveled faster than truth. Victoria's treatment of me also became more personal. She began stopping me in hallways for no real reason, asking pointed questions about tasks that had already been completed. She commented on how I spoke, how I stood, how I responded. Once, while I was setting coffee service in the library, she glanced at the notebook tucked half beneath a magazine on the side table. "You still make notes," she said. I reached for it immediately. "Only work lists." Her expression suggested she did not believe me. "Ambition can be such an unattractive thing in the wrong setting," she said softly. Then she walked away. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because it was never really about ambition. It was about permission. The women like Victoria believed ambition looked elegant only when it wore the right last name, the right skim, the right social connections. In someone like me, ambition offended her because it disrupted the order she trusted. The worst part was that Damian noticed. At first, only in fragments. A lingering silence when Victoria corrected me too sharply in front of the staff. A tightened jaw when she asked me to redo tasks that had already been approved. A look I caught once from across the living room after she told me, in front of 2 event planners, that some people confuse education with class. He never responded immediately. That was his way. Damian Sterling was not impulsive. He observed first, measured second, and spoke only when he had decided what mattered. But the more Victoria pressed, the more visible his frustration became. One evening, I was organizing catering lists in the kitchen for another small gathering Victoria planned to host, as she walked in holding a guest sheet and placed it on the counter beside me. "You misspelled Mrs. Holloway's foundation title." I looked down. I had not touched the document. The assistant prepared those sheets. "I'm sorry," I said, because apology was sometimes easier than correction. Victoria leaned against the counter. "That's another difference, isn't it?" I stayed still. "What difference?" "The difference between being near accomplished people and actually being one." Her eyes traveled over me with deliberate slowness. Exposure can be misleading. I knew she wanted a reaction. She had wanted one from the beginning. But what she seemed unable to accept was that humiliation had long stopped being new to me. Life had already trained me to carry more than her words. My mother's illness, unpaid bills, the shame of leaving school, the exhaustion of pretending disappointment was temporary when I no longer knew if it was. Those things had already hardened parts of me Victoria could not touch, no matter how elegantly she tried. So I answered only, "Is there anything else you need changed?" That was the moment her composure slipped. Only slightly. But I saw her mouth tightened. Her eyes sharpened. She had given me every reason to shrink, and I had remained steady. To her, that steadiness now looked like defiance. She straightened and picked up the paper. "Yes. Stop carrying yourself like this place owes you something." Then she left. I stood there alone in the kitchen, my hands flat against the counter, until the cold stone steadied me again. What I did not know was that Damian had been standing just beyond the half-open door long enough to hear the last part of it. I only realized later, when I stepped into the hallway and found him near the study, silent, his expression unreadable. For a second, I thought he might say something. Instead, his eyes moved over my face as if checking whether the damage had landed where Victoria intended. Then he asked, very quietly, "Are you all right?" The question undid me more than the insult had. Not outwardly, I did not cry. I did not confess how tired I was becoming. But something inside me shifted. "I'm fine," I said. He looked like he knew I wasn't. Still, he let the lie stand. That restraint should have comforted me. Instead, it made the tension worse. Because I could feel his awareness everywhere after that. In meetings held in the penthouse, when his gaze flickered toward the doorway as I passed. In the way he began giving instructions directly to staff when Victoria tried to override them. In the silence that gathered, whenever she said something cruel enough to make the room notice. The unexpected twist came a few days later, when one of the junior staff members quietly warned me that Victoria had asked the agency for my file again. Not to dismiss me. To review everything. My references. My education. My address. My history. She was no longer trying only to embarrass me. She was searching for a weakness. By then the household could feel it too. Tension moved through the penthouse like static before a storm. Conversations stopped when Victoria entered a room. Even the chef, who normally tolerated anything for the sake of employment, muttered under his breath one morning that the place had become unbearable. And still Damian watched. Quietly. Closely. More closely than he should have. That made Victoria reckless. Because jealousy always becomes most dangerous when it realizes dignity cannot be broken privately. It needs an audience. It needs a scene large enough to restore control. By the end of the week, she had chosen exactly that. Another gathering, more guests, more witnesses. And this time, she intended to humiliate me so completely that no one, not even Damian, could interrupt it without exposing something far bigger than household tension. Victoria's final plan was already in motion, and before the next evening was over, she would try to destroy Aria Bennett in front of the entire room. But Damian Sterling's response would shatter the illusion of his perfect life for good. By the time Victoria's next event began, the penthouse no longer felt like a home to me. It felt like a trap that had been polished until it gleamed. Every candle on the dining tables had been placed with precision. Every glass reflected the low amber light in soft, expensive flashes. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the evening sky as if the city itself had come dressed for the occasion. Inside, the apartment filled once again with the people Victoria admired most: investors, fashion executives, old money couples, and the kind of guests who treated exclusivity like a religion. I already knew what she was planning. Not the details. She was too careful for that. But I understood the shape of it. The way she kept scanning the room before the first guests even finished their champagne. The strange calmness in her smile. The extra sweetness in her voice whenever she gave me instructions within hearing distance of others. Women like Victoria did not prepare that carefully unless they intended to turn humiliation into theater. And this time, she wanted a larger audience. I moved through the room with a tray in my hands, keeping my expression neutral. My shoulders straight, my breathing even. The other staff members were quieter than usual. Everyone could feel the strain in the air, even if the guests could not yet name it. Damian stood near the far side of the living room, speaking with two investors from Chicago. From a distance, he looked like he always did, controlled, composed, impossible to read. But I had begun to notice the small changes in him. The shorter patience when Victoria performed too much. The way his eyes followed tension before his words ever did. The silence that settled over him whenever she came too close to the line of decency. Tonight, that silence felt sharper. Victoria waited until the room was full. Of course she did. Cruelty needed witnesses when insecurity became desperate enough. Dinner had not started yet. Guests were still drifting between the bar and the sitting area, making easy conversation about markets, charity boards, and the upcoming wedding everyone still assumed was inevitable. I had just stepped forward to offer a tray of drinks to a group near the fireplace when Victoria's voice rose lightly above the room. "Oh no," she said, with a laugh soft enough to sound charming. "Not that tray." I stopped. Several faces turned toward us. Victoria walked over with the graceful confidence of someone stepping into a spotlight she had been waiting for all evening. She smiled at the guests first, then looked at me. "I'm so sorry," she said, though she clearly wasn't. "I keep forgetting that not everyone understands presentation." A few people gave uncertain smiles, unsure whether they were meant to laugh. I lowered the tray slightly. Would you like me to replace it? She tilted her head. That depends. Do you actually know what you did wrong? There it was. That familiar tightening in the room. The small pause before people decide whether they will be decent or merely comfortable. I could feel eyes settling on me from every direction. Some curious. Some embarrassed. Some already retreating into silence because silence cost them nothing. I kept my voice steady. If there's a change you'd prefer, I can make it. Victoria smiled wider, but her eyes had gone cold. That's always your answer, isn't it? Quiet, careful. As if politeness can hide the fact that some people are simply out of place. A woman standing beside her looked down at her glass. No one spoke. Victoria reached toward the tray, lifted one of the glasses, then placed it back with exaggerated delicacy. This is what happens when people are allowed too close to worlds they were never meant to enter. They start to imitate what they see without understanding any of it. The words landed exactly where she wanted them to. Not only on me, on my race, my class. My presence in the room at all. The cruelty was elegant enough that anyone who wanted to excuse it still could. That was what made it uglier. I felt heat rise behind my ribs, but I refused to let it reach my face. She wanted visible pain. She wanted confirmation that she could still reduce me in front of the same kind of audience that had once praised her. I would not give her that. So I stood still. That seemed to anger her even more. She took one slow step closer. Tell me, Arya, she said, her voice smooth as silk. When you look around this room, do you ever confuse service with belonging? The question tore through the air. A man near the fireplace cleared his throat awkwardly. Another guest shifted his weight and looked toward Damian at last, because now the cruelty had become too obvious to ignore, and everyone needed to know which version of him they were about to witness. I did not answer her, not because I had nothing to say, but because some questions are too ugly to dignify with words. Victoria let out a faint laugh. I thought so. Then Damian spoke. That's enough. He did not raise his voice, but the authority in it cut across the room so cleanly that even the music seemed to fall back. Victoria turned slowly. Damian? No, he said, just that. No performance. No effort to soften the room. No private rescue hidden inside a polished tone. He crossed the space between us with measured steps, and when he stopped, he did not stand beside Victoria. He stood beside me, the room noticed. So did she. His gaze remained on Victoria, hard and steady. You will not speak to her like that again. The silence that followed was devastating. Victoria blinked, stunned less by the words than by the publicness of them. You're embarrassing me, she said quietly. The first crack finally appearing in her composure. His expression did not change. You were doing that well enough on your own. A sharp stillness moved through the guests. Some looked away at once. Others stared openly now, because the engagement they all admired had just split down the middle in front of them. Victoria's face lost color. Over her. Damian's answer came without hesitation. Over what is right. I felt the words more than I heard them. Not because they saved me. Nothing about the moment felt simple enough to call saving, but because they forced the room to see something it had avoided until now. Victoria's cruelty was not refinement. It was rot, and Damian, for the first time, had chosen not to decorate it. He turned then, finally looking at me. Arya, he said, his voice quieter, you can put the tray down. It was such a small sentence, yet it nearly undid me. Not because it was tender. Because it treated me like a person standing inside the moment, not a prop trapped inside someone else's power game. I set the tray onto the side table carefully. When I straightened, Victoria was still staring at him, but now I saw the truth settle into her face with humiliating clarity. This was no longer about me being the room. This was about the man she thought she understood becoming someone else right in front of her. And that frightened her more than my presence ever had. As the guests stood frozen in the wreckage of Victoria's humiliation, she finally understood the real danger. Arya Bennett had never been the true threat to her future. Because the most irreversible change had happened inside Damian Sterling himself. After Damian spoke, the room never truly recovered. The guests tried. Of course they did. Wealthy people were experts at pretending they had not just witnessed something intimate, ugly, and irreversible. A few conversations restarted in low voices. Someone near the bar laughed too lightly at something that was not funny. Glasses were lifted, plates were adjusted, and every person in that penthouse acted as though the evening could still be saved by etiquette. But some moments are too honest to be hidden by elegance. Victoria knew it. I knew it. And judging by the stillness in Damian's face, he knew it too. I stepped away from the center of the room as soon as I could, carrying myself toward the service hallway with controlled movements that cost me more effort than I wanted to admit. My hands were steady, but only because I had trained them to be. Inside, everything felt strangely hollow, like the emotional impite had arrived all at once and then gone silent, that no triumph came with it. That was the part people never understood. Humiliation does not become victory simply because someone finally interrupts it. The damage still lands. The room still remembers. The body still carries the weight of being watched while someone tries to reduce you. In the kitchen, the chef glanced at me, then quickly away. One of the servers murmured that he could take the next tray, but I shook my head. I needed movement. I needed something ordinary to do with my hands, while the rest of me tried to settle. A few minutes later, the event ended earlier than planned. That alone told everyone how serious the damage was. Victoria had spent days shaping the evening, curating every detail, managing every list, selecting every guest with obsessive care. For her to let it collapse before the final course meant she understood there was no recovery left to stage. Guests began leaving in controlled waves. No one said goodbye too loudly. No one lingered. Damian stood near the entrance with the face of a man who had just seen something in his own life he could no longer unsee. Victoria remained several feet away from him, smiling when necessary, but the distance between them had become impossible to miss. It was not the distance of anger anymore. It was recognition. Two people discovering, far too late and far too publicly, that the values holding them together had never actually been the same. When the final elevator doors closed and the penthouse returned to silence, I expected to be dismissed for the night. Instead, I found Damian standing alone near the windows, the skyline shining behind him like a field of cold stars. His jacket was gone. His tie had been loosened. For the first time since I had known him, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man standing inside the wreckage of his own certainty. I tried to pass quietly. "Area." His voice stopped me. I turned. For a second, neither of us spoke. The apartment was so still that even the hum of the city below felt distant. Then he said, "I should have stopped it sooner." There was no performance in the sentence. No dramatic regret meant to make him look noble. Just truth. I held the folded napkin in my hands a little tighter. "You stopped it, after letting it happen more than once." The honesty of that struck me harder than apology would have. Because he was right. Victoria had not become cruel overnight. He had seen enough. He had simply chosen not to act until her cruelty collided with something inside him he could no longer ignore. I looked down for a moment, then back at him. Most people never stop it at all. His expression shifted slightly, as if the answer only made him feel worse. "That may be true," he said, "but it isn't a defense." No, it wasn't. And in that moment I understood the real change in him. It was not that he had defended me. It was that he had started judging himself by a standard more uncomfortable than power. Character. He glanced toward the empty dining room where Victoria's carefully arranged evening had come apart. "I spent a long time believing success made the important things obvious," he said quietly. "It doesn't. It just gives people more elegant ways to hide what they are." I had no answer ready for that. Maybe because I had spent so long surviving inside other people's masks that hearing one of them name the truth aloud felt almost unfamiliar. He looked at me again more directly now. "You never once tried to use any of this." I understood what he meant. I had never asked for sympathy, never leveraged my education, never thrown Victoria's cruelty back into the room for advantage. In his world, where most people traded every weakness and secret like currency, that restraint had become legible to him in a way it never had before. "I came here to work," I said, "not to prove anything." A sad kind of understanding touched his face. And somehow that proved more than everyone else in this apartment. Before I could respond, I heard Victoria's footsteps. She entered the room without hurry, but she no longer looked like the woman who had once treated the penthouse as a stage built for her. The confidence was still there, but cracked now, sharpened by humiliation and something even harder for her to bear, clarity. Her eyes moved first to Damian, then to me. For a moment, I thought she might start again. Another cutting remark, another polished insult wrapped in grace. But when she spoke, her voice was lower than I expected. "This is what it is now." Damian turned toward her fully. "This is what it should have been sooner." Victoria gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Don't do that. Don't rewrite this into morality because you finally got tired of pretending." The words were meant for him, but they landed on all three of us. Because she was not entirely wrong. He had pretended. About her, about himself, about the kind of life he was building, and the kind of woman that life had chosen to reward. He did not deny it. Instead, he said the one thing I think she feared more than any betrayal. "I can't marry someone who needs another person diminished to feel elevated." The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face changed, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for me to see that this, not me, not the staff, not the ruined event, was the real ending she had failed to imagine. Her jealousy had not protected her place in his life. It had exposed everything hollow about it. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she looked at me, and there was still resentment there, but now it had been stripped of superiority. What remained was bitterness, and the private shock of losing to something she never valued, dignity. She left without another word. And just like that, the penthouse felt different. Not lighter, not healed, but honest. In the days that followed, Damian made changes that reached far beyond his engagement. He restructured the household through direct management instead of social interference. He removed Victoria from the charitable foundation they had planned to launch together. At work, I later learned, he also began reshaping parts of Sterling dynamics, scholarship initiatives, hiring reforms, education access programs. Quiet decisions, but real ones. The kind made by someone who had finally understood that power meant very little if it only protected itself. As for me, I kept working. I did not ask for revenge. I did not want the story told in whispers through Manhattan social circles. I kept reading in the staff lounge, kept carrying my notebooks, kept rebuilding the future I had lost one page at a time, but something had changed all the same. Not because a billionaire noticed me, because the room that once tried to make me feel invisible had finally been forced to see what dignity looked like when it refused to kneel. And in the end, that was what changed everything. Not Victoria's cruelty, not Damian's wealth, not even the scandal of a broken engagement. Just the quiet truth that character reveals itself most clearly in the way people treat the person they think cannot affect their future. They had all underestimated that, especially him. And maybe that was the real reason this story did not belong to the woman who tried to humiliate me or the man who finally stopped her. It belonged to the moment their power failed to define me. But what Damian Sterling did the following week, after reading the last notebook I accidentally left behind, would open a door neither of us had expected, and it would prove that the end of Victoria Langford was only the beginning of something far bigger. If the story has an impact on your heart, like and subscribe my channel and share it with your friends. Bless you all.